Get started. It's time for our third session in our Current Directions in Psychological Science speaker series. So those of you that are just joining us, welcome. And for those of us that have been with us for the previous two, thanks for sticking with us. So I'd like to start off by introducing our guest speaker, Gary Wells, who is Professor of Psychology at Iowa State University, where he also holds the title of Distinguished Professor and the Stavish Chair in the Social Sciences. Dr. Wells is also Director of Social Science for the American Judicature Society's Institute of Forensic Science and Public Policy. Most of this work has been focused on the reliability of eyewitness identification. His research-based proposals on lineup procedures, such as his idea of double-blind lineup, are being increasingly accepted in law enforcement practices all across the U.S. And today, his talk will focus on using psychological science to reduce mistaken identifications in criminal cases.
Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, I suppose, depending on where you're at. Today, I want to talk about eyewitness identification. And this is a problem that I've been working on for a very long time. And here's what I want to do today. So here's an overview. I want to start off by asking the question, is there a problem? And I'm going to point to DNA exonerations as one line of evidence that there's a problem. We've actually known there was a problem well before forensic DNA testing was used based on the kinds of experiments I'm going to tell you about. But I'm going to start there. And then I'll tell you about the methods that we use to study this problem scientifically. And then I'll tell you about a relatively simple but very important kind of psychological process that has been useful for us in helping to understand the problem and address solutions to the problem. And I also want to tell you about something called false certainty. This is where someone is absolutely positive, but they're wrong. How does that happen, and is there anything that can be done about that? And then I want to talk about reforms to eyewitness identification procedures, certainly a certain set of reforms that come out of this line of research that have been actually adopted by a number of law enforcement agencies across the country. When we think about convictions of the innocent, it wasn't really that many years ago that people didn't really think that innocent people were convicted and imprisoned in the United States. But since about 1992 to present, forensic DNA testing, which most people think about as something that incriminates the guilty, and it does, but it also has this incredible exonerating power. It can prove also that someone did not do it. And these DNA exoneration cases, which I'll go into just a little bit here, show that mistaken eyewitness identification is the primary evidence that was used to convict these innocent people. We began looking at these cases as they were unfolding, and in 1998 we published an article in Law and Human Behavior. This is Table 1 from that article, in which we took the first 40 DNA exoneration cases, because what we wanted to know was, what we all should want to know is, here are 40 people the first 40 people who were freed with DNA testing. These are people who were convicted of crimes they did not commit. Why? People like Kirk Bloodsworth, who was convicted of murder and rape in 1985. He was actually sentenced to death in Maryland. It was later reduced to a life sentence, more or less on a technicality. And then this number after the slash year, 9, that's how many years he served before forensic DNA testing proved that he was, in fact, innocent. Kirk Bloodsworth had never been in trouble with the law in his life. But what was the evidence that led to him being convicted? Well, in his case, 5 witnesses mistakenly identified him. Now, you'll notice here that there's usually something else. For example, in Kirk Bloodsworth's case, self-incriminating statements. Well, how can an innocent person make self-incriminating statements? Well, he really didn't. But what happens is, and this is an important psychological phenomenon in and of itself, I think, is that in the context of eyewitnesses having identified him and the power that that has in people's minds, even ambiguous statements seem incriminating and got used against him. Importantly then, as we look down at these cases, and I've sort of circled these as we kind of run through them here, you'll see that mistaken identification is driving these cases. It's the common element in here. And in fact, there are now over 273, and I say over, every time I prepare a slide I have to say over whatever the latest count is. There was one yesterday. And 205 of those, 75%, are cases involving mistaken eyewitness identification. So mistaken eyewitness identification is driving more of these convictions of innocent people than all other causes combined. But there's something really important, too, to keep in mind about these. And by the way, here's a picture that I've, sort of a collage that I put together of just 99 of these people. I've had the good fortune of meeting many of them. There's Kirk Bloodsworth. If you can see my cursor kind of circling his face down around the center there, that's Kirk Bloodsworth, who was, in fact, sentenced to death row and fortunately later exonerated with DNA evidence. But it can only be a small slice of the cases, because when you go back and try to look at these claims of people in prison who claim to be mistakenly identified, and Innocence Projects know this very well, what you find is that, well, the biological evidence was never collected, so there is no DNA, or the biological evidence was not collected properly, so it can't be analyzed, or the biological evidence was destroyed, or it deteriorated, or the biological evidence was lost, or the big category here, the big reason why it can only be a small slice of these cases is because there was no biological evidence. In fact, only a fraction of cases can actually be analyzed with DNA tests because most crimes, most serious crimes, do not leave behind definitive biological evidence. It's actually rare to have DNA-rich biological trace evidence for murders, muggings, burglaries, drive-by shootings, and robberies, and so on. In fact, overall, we estimate that fewer than 5% of eyewitness cases have any DNA evidence, which is a huge problem because it takes something, for the most part, as definitive as DNA to trump an eyewitness. Now, I began doing this kind of work about 35 years ago, and there's nothing mysterious about the paradigm. Any good psychology student who's taken a research methods course can probably come up with this themselves. What we do is we create events for unsuspecting people, right? And because we created the event, such as this one right here, which is kind of a demonstration that I sometimes use, called the bomber on the roof, and then later you learn that that person who you saw out there had planted, let's say, a bomb down that air shaft. Because we created the event, we know exactly what happened and who that person was. We then do this over and over again for large numbers of witnesses, and who we can then have, for example, view a lineup. And when they view this lineup, we know who the real perpetrator is. We also know whether the perpetrator is even in there or not, which is something that, of course, we manipulate as well. So we can score people when we get some kind of, for example, identification decision from them for whether they identified the right person or identified the wrong person. We can also assess, for example, how certain they are in their identification. And when you do this, of course, what you find is that there's no single rate of mistaken identification. That would be a misnomer to think that way. It varies, and so, of course, what we do in this kind of paradigm, basic paradigm, is we take a look at these kinds of variations. For example, manipulating the nature of the witnessed event, the characteristics of the witnesses themselves, young, old, black, white, male, female, the kinds of instructions they get prior to viewing a lineup, which turn out to be very important, as well as the type of lineup that they view. We've actually created a new type of lineup that's being used in many jurisdictions now across the country, and the behaviors of the lineup administrator. It turns out those are very important as well, and I'll speak to that at some point here. But of course, what's happened over the years is that we've created a very large empirical literature on eyewitness identification using this kind of controlled laboratory methodology. And you can see reviews of this literature so extensive that there's no way that I can do more than just touch on it, but I'll touch on what I think are some very important things. And one of the things that's really important is to look at something that represents a recurring pattern. I mean, you know, science is based on patterns. And so one pattern that I want to tell you about is something that when we discovered it, we started calling it the relative judgment process. The relative judgment process. When I tell you about the relative judgment process, it's going to sound so simple that it will seem really like a very benign psychological process, sort of like, well, sure, so what? And it's very simple. When eyewitnesses view a lineup, they tend to select the person from that lineup who looks most like the perpetrator relative to other members of the lineup. In other words, what happens is witnesses compare one to another, decide who looks most like him, that must be him, and end up making an identification from that. We discovered that a long time ago, and we've used it in a variety of ways to address this mistaken identification problem. Now let me tell you and demonstrate for you why this relative judgment problem is in fact, the relative judgment process is in fact a problem. And I think it's best demonstrated through this experiment where what we did was we staged a crime 200 times for 200 separate witnesses. And for half of those, randomly assigned, each of them saw this photographic lineup. And by the way, most lineups are actually done in this country with photos, unlike what you see on TV. There are live lineups done. Sometimes they're just done after the photos, and so they're really not very diagnostic of much. Most of the action is here at the level of these photo lineups. And when we showed this lineup to our witnesses, 54% were able to pick him out. Right there, he's number 3. Now, there's nothing magic about 54%. That's just an absolute number. That's going to go up or down as a function of lots of things, how good of a view we give them, and so on. What's important here is the pattern that emerges. I want to draw your attention to this, which I just underlined. If you look at the bottom of the screen, hopefully it's working for you, you can see that there's a red underlining there. All witnesses were warned that the actual perpetrator might not be in the lineup. And, in fact, 21% made no choice. So 21% were saying, I don't think he's there, or I can't be sure enough to make an identification. Now, what we wanted to know was, for the other half of these witnesses who were randomly assigned to get another version of this, what happens now? If we take the culprit's photo, remove him from the lineup, and replace him with no one. Okay? So for the other half, he's not there. Also, keep in mind, and I've circled it this time because this is very important, those witnesses, too, were all warned that the actual perpetrator might not be in the lineup. And the question now is, where does the 54% go? Because it has to go somewhere. If you add up all these numbers, the 54, the 3, the 3, 13, 3, 3, and 21, that's 100%. It has to go somewhere. It can't stay there. There's no one in that slot, right? And one possibility, of course, is that it slides down here and joins those who made no choice. So now you have 75% making no choice. But I already told you about relative judgment, so you know that's not quite what's going to happen. In fact, it's not 54% that slide down there. Instead, only 11% do. The dominant tendency then, in this case, is to go to who they think is the next best identification. So they're making a mistake because he's absent. Notice that even these people's numbers go up, right? So they don't all shift to no choice. That's what we mean by relative judgments. Now who looks most like them, okay? And the problem with a relative judgment process then is that someone's always going to look more like the perpetrator than the remaining members of the lineup, even when the actual perpetrator is not in the lineup. So we had done this kind of work and made this kind of argument that basically the big problem for eyewitnesses is recognizing the absence of the perpetrator because of relative judgments. And in fact, every DNA exoneration case, as it turns out later when DNA came along, is exactly like that. The witnesses never had an opportunity to identify the real perpetrator because the identification test they were given did not include the real perpetrator. So there are a lot of implications of the relative judgment problem. One is that this is why you have to warn witnesses before viewing a lineup that the actual culprit might not be there. Now, we did that in this experiment, and we still got relative judgments, as you saw. But it would be even worse than that if we did not give that warning, and we've done that kind of study. Second, this is why it's very important when selecting fillers, the stand-ins for a lineup, that they fit the witness's description of the perpetrator and their significant features. After all, if you have a suspect, if the witness described the person as let's say, a white male with short dark hair in his 20s, and your suspect is a white male with short dark hair in his 20s, but everyone else either has long hair or the hair's not dark, or they're not in their 20s, or they're not, then he's going to stand out. He's going to be the one who fits the witness's description better than the others, and therefore relative judgment is going to lead the person to pick him, even if it's not him. And then a third implication, and there are more, but these are three big ones, is that this led us to speculate that maybe we can create a new type of lineup, a type of lineup that helps prevent witnesses from simply using relative judgments. And so that's what we did. We created what's called the sequential lineup. Now, we needed a name for what it is that represents the traditional lineup that's used in law enforcement today, so we call it the simultaneous lineup. The idea is that they're all presented simultaneously, whether it's a live lineup or a photo lineup. And recall that what we identified as a problem here is that witnesses tend to compare one to another, try to decide who looks most like them, and then identify that person. And that's not really what we want them to do. We want them to not make a decision about who looks most like them. There's always someone who looks most like your memory of the perpetrator. We want to know, is this the perpetrator or not? So we want something, instead of a relative judgment, more absolute. So we created a sequential lineup. And the sequential lineup works like this. They see them one at a time. Mrs. Jones, I'm going to show you a number of photos. Ideally, you don't let her know how many. You're going to make a decision on each one before I show you the next. Is this the man you saw pull the trigger? Yes, no, or not sure. So let's notice that she can't make a comparison to one of the other photos. She has to try to make the comparison back to her memory. Now, let's suppose she says no. She says no to this one, gets to this one. And it's true that you can sort of make a relative judgment, like, well, this guy looks more like him than numbers 1 or 2 did. But I don't know what number 4 is going to look like. He might look even more like him. And so the idea is that witnesses quickly, by the very nature of the task, realize they can't just compare one to another. They have to compare each one to their memory and make more of an absolute identification decision. And there's been a lot of work testing the simultaneous versus sequential lineup over the years. In a recent meta-analysis published by Leippe and her colleagues, 72 experimental tests involving over 13,000 participant witnesses in various studies. And one of the ways to take a look at this, the results from this, is to look at what are called diagnosticity ratios, sometimes called in the legal system an index of probative value. And what it really is just a ratio of hits to false alarms. So what you want to know is, as a juror, let's say, how diagnostic was that lineup? What's the ratio of hits to false alarms? You want, obviously, that to be as high of a ratio as possible. And based on the Leippe et al. Meta-analysis, the simultaneous produced across these studies a diagnosticity ratio of about 5.8. The sequential produced a diagnosticity ratio of about 8.3. So the sequential tends to be more diagnostic. When you get an identification using the sequential, you can better trust it. Now, that's one kind of important line of development, looking at how do we take what we know, what we learned, what we discovered about, for example, relative judgment process, and improve on the reliability of eyewitness identifications. But eyewitness certainty, this is a really important issue because the self-reported certainty of the eyewitness determines a lot of things. It determines, for example, whether prosecutors will decide to prosecute. If the witness isn't certain, they may decide not to prosecute. Eyewitness certainty determines whether judges are going to permit the eyewitness to give testimony at trial, even under conditions in which the procedure was highly suggestive. So if the witness is certain, even suggestive procedures will they'll still allow the witness to testify. So certainty matters, and it's the primary factor determining whether or not jurors are going to believe whether an eyewitness made an accurate identification, and we know that on the basis of, for example, jury simulation studies. So in the end, what happens is eyewitness certainty is the nexus. It's the connection between mistaken identification and convictions of the innocent. Mistaken identification that happens and the witness isn't certain is not likely to result in a conviction of an innocent person. But if a mistaken identification happens and the witness is certain, then there's a fairly high probability that that person is going to be convicted. What do we know? Remember when I showed you the paradigm that we use? We're always measuring accuracy and certainty in these studies. What do we know then about the relation between certainty and accuracy? Well, it turns out they are related, and meta-analyses indicate that the correlation between the two could be as high as 0.40. Now, that's a very liberal estimate. Very few studies find 0.40. Mostly it's well under that. But let's say it's as high as 0.40, and that would be under what we call pristine conditions, and I'll come back to what I mean by that. That correlation, even if it were as high as 0.40, is not that high. It's lower than the correlation between height and gender. So, for example, if you were to try to use somebody's height, all I give you is information about their height. For example, here's an adult, 5'10". What do you guess? What do you predict, male or female? You should predict male, and you're going to be right more often than you're going to be wrong, but sometimes you'll be wrong. Or I say, here's an adult, 5'6", 5 feet 6 inches tall. What do you predict, male or female? You should predict female, and you're going to be right more often than you're going to be wrong, but sometimes you'll be wrong there too. Well, that correlation, the ability to predict gender from height or sex from height, is greater than the accuracy confidence correlation. Still, this accuracy confidence correlation has some meaning, some utility. The problem here is that the way identifications are commonly obtained within the legal system creates a lot of ambiguity about the meaning of eyewitness identification certainty. In other words, they're not really collecting it in the right way. The key here is to understand that false certainty, that's where a witness is absolutely positive but wrong. In all the DNA exoneration cases, the witnesses were positive at trial but mistaken. The key here is to understand that eyewitnesses can be influenced even after they've made a choice from the lineup. And so, for example, there's nothing to prevent, and in fact it's fairly common for law enforcement to give what we now call feedback. So if the witness picks the suspect from the lineup, good, you identified the actual suspect. Or, yes, you got him. Or in one case that really led me to launch this line of work we know that when the witness was asked then at trial, what, if anything, did three detectives administered a photo lineup to her. What, if anything, did the detectives say or do when you pointed to number 3? And she said, they clapped. So we wanted to know, well, is this a problem, getting this kind of feedback? And so we created a new paradigm. And in this paradigm, what happens is, as usual, people witness an event. They then make a lineup identification, and then we randomly assign them to some kind of feedback. So, for example, through a random assignment, we don't care who they pick. If the coin flip comes out a certain way, we say, good, you identified the suspect. If it comes out the other way, we say, nothing, right? We've done other things like giving them disconfirming feedback and so on, but we're going to focus on giving confirming feedback or saying nothing to them, right? And furthermore, then what we do is we take various measures. For example, we're asking them questions then later about the witnessed event and about their lineup identification. Now notice this feedback manipulation right here, for which they're randomly assigned, occurs after they've already witnessed the event, after they've already made their identification. Therefore, it should not really influence their answers to questions about, for example, how good of a view they had or how certain they were at the time they made their identification. So we asked them lots of questions about that. Keep in mind that then these are very critical kinds of questions that are asked in real cases. How certain were you at the time of your identification that you identified the gunman? How good was the view you had of the gunman? How closely were you paying attention? And other very testimony-relevant questions that really determine the credibility of this witness in the minds of, for example, a jury. And let me show you some very important then kinds of data from this. This is a little unusual. These are not means. What I'm going to show you is the percent of witnesses who score at the extreme. So for instance, take a look here. In the control condition, where we gave no feedback, in this particular study, about 15% report that they were positive or nearly positive at the time they made their identification. This is important. This is actually all false confidence because all of these witnesses in this study made mistaken identifications because we didn't put the real person in there. We didn't create this 15%. We don't exactly know where it comes from, but that's false certainty. Only 3 or 4% are saying they got a good view, which is good because we gave them a lousy view. Only a couple of percent are saying they could make out details of the face, 3% or something, which is good because we gave them such a bad view they couldn't make out details of the face. But look what happens to the comparison group, for which all we did was said, oh, good, you identified the suspect. That's the whole manipulation. On the question of how certain were you at the time, now you've got 45% or 44% saying that they were positive or nearly positive at the time. You have over a quarter of them now saying they had a great view. And this is on the basis of one simple comment, a comment of confirming feedback that often gets repeated to witnesses over and over again before they ever get to trial. So this is a very important phenomenon because all of the difference between here and here, right, is manufactured false certainty. In other words, this was created not through some kind of natural process, but by the fact that the lineup administrator was permitted to just simply respond to the witness's choice before they ever answered any questions about their certainty. So from this line of work to try to get to the main conclusions here, we've generated a number of research-based reforms or reform recommendations to the legal system. One is the pre-lineup instruction, that all witnesses need to be instructed that the culprit might or might not be in the lineup before they view that lineup, so that they realize that none of the above is a legitimate possible answer. And you might think, oh, well, surely they do that. But in fact, surveys of police departments show that large percentages don't do that and had no intent of ever doing that. Also, this is why another recommendation is that fillers need to fit the witness's description of the culprit. Lineups are often put together in which some individuals in the lineup don't fit the witness's description at all, making the suspect, whether even if innocent, stand out. We're recommending the sequential method of presentation with something that we call backloading. Backloading is where the witness does not know how many people they're going to view. This helps keep them just comparing each person to their memory and not realize when they might be getting to the end of the sequence where they might then fall back on relative judgments. We recommend double-blind administration. This is where the person who administers the lineup does not know which person in the lineup is the possible suspect and which ones are fillers, so they cannot influence the witness. That's a whole other line of work that I haven't talked about today, but I think that those who know about the experimenter expectancy effect, for example, know the importance of the double-blind administration recommendation of the system. And then finally, related to the last point we were talking about, it's important to collect a certainty statement from the witness at the time of identification, taken by this blind administrator who doesn't know, did they pick a filler, did they pick the suspect, before they can possibly get any of this kind of feedback or reinforcement that might inflate their certainty. This work has been really quite successful, especially in the last few years. There are a number of jurisdictions that have made these reforms, adopted these recommendations, which include the sequential and the double-blind and so on. The entire states of New Jersey, North Carolina, and Ohio, most of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Florida, Texas, and so on. Major cities like Denver, Santa Clara County, California, which has a very large population, Dallas, and some other jurisdictions. And there are reforms pending at the state level in California, Connecticut, New York, and other commissions have been established in other states. And so we've made, I think psychological science has made a nice contribution here to a very practical problem and with pretty good success. There's still a lot more to be done to help improve the reliability of this evidence overall, and it'll never be perfectly reliable evidence, and so it's important that that psychological science continue to look at ways to help sort between accurate and mistaken identifications.
So now the question is, how do you bring this interesting new research into your course? And so I'd like to turn it over to our master teacher, Michael Leippe, for our interactive Q&A. Now, Dr. Leippe is a professor of psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York. He is an experimental social psychologist with a research focus centered on social influence and cognition in several realms. So we're going to be taking questions now. Some people already sent in their questions ahead of time. And anyone on the call now, we welcome your questions or comments, which you can enter using the questions chat bar on your webinar toolbar. Okay? So I'll jump right in and ask one of the first questions we have is from an instructor. And the question is, could you incorporate this topic into an undergraduate research methods course? And if so, do you have suggestions for how you could do this?
Well, first of all, hello. And so, can I be heard and everything?
Yes, you are.
Yeah,
hello.
I'm good. Okay, hi. Yeah, I mean it's a great topic for an undergraduate research methods course, I think. The research that's been done in this area has often been characterized by very elegant and straightforward, but relatively simple designs that can be easily explained to a class. So it's a good place for a discussion of research design. We're going to look at we want to know what factors influence eyewitness memory or eyewitness accuracy. We're going to have a control group in which they view a crime. They're asked to make identification. The other group gets everything the same except the factor that we think might have an influence, such as good, you identified the suspect, or lineup instructions, something like that. So it lends itself very nicely. In fact, Gary Wells basically talked about a number of years ago the lineup as an experiment analogy, where basically you can actually describe how a lineup has characteristics of an experiment. We need to keep the the suspect. I'm sorry. Yeah, the witness is asked questions. The manipulation is you've got a suspect, you've got other people. The question the administrator doesn't know, is also blind to it. The question is, holding everything else constant, will the face be recognized? So, I mean, it's a great paradigm for discussing research methods. The other thing that you can discuss in a research methods class with this material is experiment or expectancy effects, as Gary talked about. You can talk about field experiments versus laboratory experiments, staged crime versus simulated crimes, those kinds of effects, and basically all kinds of things related to designing research by looking at the eyewitness sort of research paradigm.
Great, thanks. I have a question that just came in from a student. And the question is, my university does not offer any forensic psychology courses, but it is definitely something I would want to explore as a career option. Is there a certain place to contact or a place to look to get some experience in this area? What would you recommend for me as a student?
Well, I think that there are various websites you can go to get information about what careers in psychology related to law and forensics are about. The American Psychology Law Society website has a nice section that talks about both the teaching of it and what careers are involved with it. As far as getting experience, that I'm not so sure of. Usually you want to use a course as a vehicle with the professor to basically find out what kinds of options there are in the community. I think the best thing to do is to go to a website that talks about psychology and law and get some ideas about that from there, and then maybe you can move it forward. Also, if there's a local university that does have people working in this field, the person might call there in the psychology department and see who might be around that they might talk to.
Great. Thank you. So speaking about the American Psychological Law Society, I have a comment that we have received, and then I'll go to a question. First, the comment was that the American Psychological Law Society website has links to their newsletter where a section is devoted to ideas for useful psych and law activities in the classroom. So that might be useful to some people who have joined us today for the webinar. And I have a question that came in from an instructor who's asking what kinds of writing assignments would help students learn and appreciate what psychological science has discovered about lineup identifications and eyewitness memory. So specifically writing assignments, do you have suggestions?
Yeah, one of the things I use when I teach psych and law, the psychology and law class, is I ask people to find a story in the news media through the web that talks about an eyewitness case or a case that involved a lot of eyewitness testimony, perhaps it was disputed. Identify in that the factors, the eyewitness factors that were seemingly involved, describe the whole case, and then go and find in the literature how those particular factors have been studied and what's been found about them, so apply the relevant research articles to this problem. Another useful writing assignment, I think, is to critique a published study that might have been published in Law and Human Behavior or Applied Cognitive Psychology or some other journal that deals with eyewitness and other kinds of psychological topics, and critique it, and in particular in critiquing it, highlight how this particular study has internal validity, how its findings are valid, but also the extent to which seemingly the researchers have tried to apply it in a way that it has some external validity. Those are really the kinds of writing projects that I use.
Great, thanks. And we just had a comment that came in that might be helpful for some of the students who brought a similar situation to our previous student. And the advice is that Texas State University at San Marcos offers a graduate certificate in advanced forensic psychology, so something some people might want to look into. But I have another question here from an instructor, somewhat related to the first question, but this one specific to social psychology. So how would this topic fit into an undergraduate psychology class? Do you have suggestions for how to incorporate it into that class?
Yeah, the field is as much populated by researchers from social psychology as it is from researchers more strictly in memory and cognition. Much of it applies to, there's a lot of psychology here. So, for example, when you're talking about social perception, social cognition, you can talk about how things like stereotypes, expectancy effects, influence, what people see in an eyewitness kind of situation, as well as what they remember. When you get to the social influence and persuasion sections, you can talk about the roles of conformity and suggestion in terms of taking questions and interviewing witnesses and getting information, and the possibility of suggesting various kinds of answers through leading questions. There's been research in social psychology that has looked at whether or not witnesses will conform to the judgments, the identifications of others. When you talk about attitudes, eyewitness confidence is sort of like a belief or an attitude about one's memory. And you can talk about how, what we know from persuasion, the kinds of things that influence people's confidence independently of whether their memory is being changed. So it can show up in many areas of social psychology, a very thematic kind of area to get into.
Great. Well, I want to stop here and just thank you so much, Dr. Leippe, Dr. Wells, for dedicating and volunteering your time, really, to share your research and teaching strategies with everyone on the webinar today. So thank you for that. And for everyone in attendance, I hope that you'll join us again. We start back in 15 minutes with our next talk, which starts at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, which will focus on industrial organizational psychology.